John is the author of AZT, Poison by Prescription, a collection of essays in the New York Native that describe the corrupt history of AZT and its devastating impact on his community, also my community, gay men. But John was more than just an AZT critic. He was also very concerned about the use of poppers, amyl nitrite inhalants, by gay men, believing them quite capable by themselves of producing immune deficiency. John is also very knowledgeable about the social dynamics and the psychological factors in the gay community at the time AIDS started. He's a skilled data analyst, which helped him stay off the HIV equals AIDS bandwagon as it careened downhill between the invention of the AIDS virus and the marketing of AZT. Welcome to the show, John.
Well, thank you, David. I'm here.
Yes. When did you first start to ask questions about the new so-called gay plague, and why did you ask those questions?
Well, I would imagine it would be about 1983. Joseph Sonneman was writing some of the early articles in the New York Native, which expressed skepticism about the whole concept of a new disease with a new infectious agent. But I started working with Hank Wilson in 1983, and it was tied to AIDS to some extent. I mean, this was before the declaration had been made that the cause of AIDS had been found, and before HIV was given its name. But Hank and I published a series of articles and pamphlets basically trying to warn gay men about the dangers of using the nitrite inhalants. Whether or not they were related in some way to AIDS, the medical literature suggested they were definitely harmful to the health.
And what were the conditions that the overuse of poppers caused?
Well, a great many things. They can kill through two different types of anemia, through heart attacks and strokes. In the long term, they are still the only tenable hypothesis we have for the occurrence of Kaposi sarcoma in gay men. And this is a premier gay drug. Virtually, there was a while when almost all active gay men used them, and virtually 100% of the early AIDS cases used poppers, as well as a lot of other drugs.
In fact, in the first paper in 1981, there was only about half a dozen cases, but all of them used poppers.
Oh, right.
And during that time period, tell us what you were doing. What kind of professional life did you have? What led you into looking into this in almost the way an investigative journalist would look into it?
Well, I was trying to balance two things. I was still working then as a market research executive and analyst, but I also had a side career as a gay activist and writer. Eventually, I had to simply concentrate on being a writer. But I read all of the early medical reports, and in the early days, there were only about maybe a dozen and a half. So you could read everything written. Now there are probably hundreds of thousands, and nobody could conceivably do it. But in looking, one thing, the early reports were very open-minded as to what the causes of AIDS might be. It wasn't even called AIDS at one point.
It was called gay-related immune deficiency, GRID, at one point.
Yeah. The possibility of toxic causes were very much considered up until the 1984 press conference, where the Secretary of Health said the probable cause had been found. But looking at the reports of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, I was really shocked by how incompetent they were. And this had to do not only with analytical things, but even the very simplest conventions of statistics they were ignorant of. And then later I realized not only that were they incompetent, but they were also extremely dishonest. So my very first articles on AIDS were to show that the CDC deliberately were trying to construe AIDS as caused by a new infectious agent rather than by the use of drugs.
And in fact, it wasn't just the use of drugs, but it was the spreading of old pathogens like those that cause syphilis or gonorrhea or hepatitis. We were really, you and I are about the same age, in kind of an urban enclaves, incestuously spreading around in a very small subset of human beings, because obviously gay men at that point in time who were out were maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population in the country, more in Manhattan, more in the big cities. And and let's talk about the sociology at the time of how we were acting. We were acting both in terms of sexual practices and in terms of ingestion of toxins, not just poppers, but all kinds of other party drugs.
Right. The first 50 AIDS cases not only used poppers, but all sorts of other drugs, and they used them very, very heavily. And of course, as far as the infectious agents went, they also had innumerable cases of venereal disease, and in every case treated with antibiotics. And antibiotics are not totally benign. I mean, they are not good to take one course after another, dozens of times. They do weaken the health and the immune system.
One thing I think in particular with antibiotics is that they damage the bacteria in the intestine, which makes sense because they're supposed to kill bacteria. And of course that results in malnutrition eventually if you wipe out that flora.
Right. I'm dealing with that right now, thanks to a course I took for some dentistry. And I don't feel sick, but on the other hand, it definitely has weakened me, just a single course.
The other factor going on at that time, I would say, that I remember, I'm 63 years old, in the late 70s, early 80s, I was moving past 30 and into my early 30s, and that was that we were sort of coming from small towns, small cities, gathering in urban enclaves, and we were coming out and proud, and we're becoming the targets of the religious right. There's a lot of stress, a lot of fear, anxiety, and depression among gay men, living this sort of hypersexual, hypersocial lifestyle, but we also were suffering the very real effects of the psychogenic effects of being a hated minority at that time, weren't we not?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And this really is the topic of the book I co-edited with Ian Young called The AIDS Cult. This is still in print, by the way, and it's a collection of essays that go into the psychosocial causes of AIDS. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned it. There are really 2 points that have to be made. One is that in addition to the others, they're very powerful psychological reasons why gay men are likely to become sick, and they have to do with basically the condemnation of the culture we live in, a condemnation based really on superstition, on Old Testament taboo. But the second point is that, I've explained in considerable detail in my book why the early AIDS cases got sick in the ways that they did get sick. But the later AIDS cases are really very different. The psychological terrorism would still be there, but a lot of the people that are now given the so-called HIV positive diagnoses aren't sick at all, but they're bullied and bamboozled into taking these drugs, and sooner or later they do get sick. Some of them, acquire an AIDS diagnosis because of the effects of the drugs, but others die before they even get a diagnosis.
Let's talk about that progression of the number of deaths attributed to these presenting illnesses that were called AIDS by virtue of presenting illness. When you talk about 1981, 82, 83, 84, 85, we're talking about 5,000 or 10,000 people dying a year of what was noticed at first called gay-related immune deficiency and then AIDS. It was what year Well, I know what it was, and you know what it was. 1987, when something really changed the whole dynamic of who was being said had AIDS.
Yes, indeed. 1987 was the year that AZT was approved for marketing by the Food and Drug Administration. And in the discourse on AIDS, it can get very complicated, but I think it's necessary to latch onto a few simple things that we know for sure. And what we do know for sure is that AZT was approved for the market on the basis of fraudulent research. I managed to get hundreds of pages of documents under the Freedom of Information Act, and it showed beyond any doubt whatever that massive cheating took place in the Phase 2 AZT trials, which were the basis for approving the drug. And furthermore...
Wait a minute. Phase 2 is normally a preliminary study.
No, before that, they do the Phase 1, which is simply to find out if it's possible to do a study at all.
Right. I thought Phase 2 was like the dosing and things like that, and Phase 3 was the sort of the large-scale trial, but maybe...
No, Phase 2 is large-scale. It's supposed to show that the drug is, number one, safe, and number two, effective. And it's the basis for the approval of the drug. Phase 3, I don't know. I mean, you could go on it. Other countries have a post-marketing surveillance plan to, after a drug's put on the market, to follow what...
Now, perhaps we should say here, we're not really saying that the drug companies were the only culprits here. There are a lot of gay men out there who said, let's have this drug. This is a single pathogen that's killing us. Let's have something that kills that pathogen. And gay men were kind of embracing AZT. At least some parts of the gay community were embracing AZT.
Some were. They were desperate. There were others who really were cold-blooded tools or agents of the drug companies. And something like ACT UP, the AIDS activists, I knew these people pretty well, and some of them were, good, decent people. They really believed it. But there were at least some in the leadership who were cold-blooded, hard-boiled tools of the pharmaceutical company. And the whole thrust of ACT UP,
Are you saying that they were, on the payroll of the drug companies, in effect?
Well, certainly the payroll. There are many ways the drug companies could reward them. Cash under the table, cash over the table, stock options, various other things. But yes, I am saying that. I don't know exactly how it worked.
What were some of the major corruptions in the AZT trials? How did the drug company and the researchers manipulate the results to get a successful outcome?
Well, I have a whole chapter in my book, The AIDS War, on the fraud in the trials, and also I think that article is on the internet, something like FDA documents show fraud in AZT trials. But it would include illegally entering people into the study. It would say that people who almost died from the toxicities of AZT suffered no adverse reactions. It would be lying about the length of time people were in the study. It would be, among other things, a total inability to account for the drug itself. People who died from AZT poisoning were counted as a death in the placebo group. There's hardly any form of cheating that did not take place in the study.
And everybody knew who was on AZT, right? That's another thing you...
Well, not everybody, but it became unblinded pretty soon, and according to the plan, neither the doctors nor patients were supposed to know who was on AZT and who was on placebo. But in fact, simply blood tests made it very, very obvious who was getting AZT, and so the doctors would certainly have known.
And it was around this time, was it not, that people who were not presenting with so-called opportunistic illnesses like KS or pneumocystis pneumonia, people simply had taken Dr. Gallo's or Dr. Montagnier's HIV test were being placed on these drugs without illness.
Well, that's the situation now, and of course, AZT is still prescribed, although not in much lower doses than before. But there's a whole mythology with the new generation of drugs, which don't kill people nearly so quickly, but on the other hand, they kill them sooner or later. And
to go back to Terry's point, in 1993, the definition of AIDS was changed so that you could have AIDS with a low CD4 cell count and a positive HIV test without any illness at all. And by the late 1990s, around 2/3 of new cases were in people who were healthy at the time of their so-called AIDS diagnosis. But the practice of giving drugs to people pre-AIDS predated 1993, right? That between 87 and 93, people started to be given drugs even though, as Terry said, they were still healthy.
Yes, there were, fairly early on, people like William Hazeltine were saying that all gay men, even if they were negative, should take the drugs to prevent them from becoming infected. And my take on that is that whether it's conscious or not, he's saying that all gay men should be killed through drugs. It's part of the homophobia of the Judeo-Christian tradition we live in.
It's really interesting that as we moved into the late 80s, we saw a lot of people, including some straight people like Arthur Ashe, people who took tests and said they were HIV positive, and they were talked into taking AZT. What do you know, John? What would you guess for the number of people who were really sickened and killed, who had no presenting illnesses, just a positive test for the proteins, for the antibodies that were supposed to be specific to HIV? How many people were we killing with this drug?
Well, here one has to guess. I mean, I followed the CDC's statistics very well year by year, but then they stopped reporting certain things. But I have a pretty good estimate that 1/3 gay men were killed by AZT poisoning. And I have a table I created, it's on my website somewhere.
Wow.
I would say, I don't even know now. They stopped reporting AIDS deaths by year, which made it impossible to track certain things.
Yeah, I noticed that also, that the statistics, especially around 1997, was a big year where the next year, all of a sudden, they'd removed all the good stuff out of the reports. All that really they concentrate now on is how many cases there are in each city, in each state, which I guess is purely for funding purposes.
Well, I think it's deliberate. I don't think they want tracking to be done on their statistics.
But if you take a look at their own statistics, though, you take a look at those 1983, 84, 85, 86, 87, really, we're talking a relative handful in a country of then to 50 million, to 60, to 70 million people, maybe 5,000, 10,000 people. It really wasn't until the late 80s when AZT came along that we really saw, even by their own figures, the number of deaths attributed to AIDS going up. That was at the point that this chemotherapy for life, this harsh drug, AZT, was being introduced. Well, let's transition now to the mid-1990s. And Dr. David Ho's hit hard, hit early with a drug cocktail. The way I have put it a number of times before is that a lot of the people who were taking AZT and who were, some of whom were actually presenting with illnesses for whatever reasons of immune deficiency, some of whom were simply taking AZT because they were trying to stave off a future disease. Then we saw David Ho rear his head and say, let's hit hard and let's hit early. These people who were taking these drugs were so far down that these weaker versions, these analogs of AZT, looked like up to them, is the way I would put it.
Well, yes, they were certainly much less poisonous, or at least immediately so, than AZT. But the whole thing is a scam. David Ho's thing of this incredible biochemical activity that is, Mark Craddock, as a mathematician, exposed it for the nonsense it is. But the truth is that if we look upon HIV, a retrovirus, as a particle, something outside of cells, something infectious, exogenous as it were. This has never been shown or demonstrated by the standard tests for isolating a virus. And so all we really have are different types of, I guess, basically chemical tests which identify genetic sequences. It would be like, say, an episode of crime scene investigation, and somebody finds a human thumb in an alley. Well, then the boys and girls from CSI show up, and they say, well, this is a human thumb. But somewhere else a human being is, either alive or dead. They don't look at the thumb and say, this is a human being. But the scientists do that. They find a genetic sequence and say, this is the virus. But it's not a virus. It's a genetic sequence that may or may not have something to do with the virus.
I'm not sure they even have a thumb. I think they have a thumbprint, or what they think is a thumbprint. It might not
okay.
be.
That's even better.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a very dark alley, so they really can't see.
Okay, that's still better.
Yes.
Right.
One thing that's always interested me is the dynamics of money and how that influenced things. I think you've talked about how much money the gay publications got from Popper's advertisements. Was the New York Native different? Did they not accept Popper's advertising?
If they did, they stopped doing so, but it was practically the sole exception. But a typical gay paper, and of course now there are very few gay publications, but in those days they would get tens of thousands of dollars from running many different full-page ads for Poppers. It was their largest source of revenue.
Well, let me tell you what has replaced that, because I've done studies, content analysis studies of this, of the Washington Blade. This is sort of, in the minds of some people, because it's in the nation's capital, the paper of record of the gay community. It's been around for 4 decades. You take a look at any edition of the Washington Blade that will come out tomorrow when we're taping this, and you'll find dozens of full-page ads for drugs. Not for Poppers anymore, but for Truvada, for Icentris, for all of the pharmaceutical company drugs that are supposed to be attacking the retrovirus. In fact, I did a content analysis showing that scores of pages in 2007 and 2008 in the Washington Blade were taken up by drug companies, particularly Gilead Sciences in Foster City, California, making Truvada. The drug ads, Poppers, in the early 80s had been replaced by the legal drug dealers, the pharmaceutical companies in gay publications. Gay publications today, to some degree, are almost owned and operated by the HIV/AIDS drug industry.
Yes, I agree. And, of course, there are other commodities, too. And the whole scam of testing, the general population is not told, get tested. But it's very much targeted to gay men, where if you were to take the general population, a certain percentage would test positive for reasons that we have no idea what they are. Nothing to do with the virus. And the same thing with gay men. If you take enough people, you will certainly get people who test positive. And on top of that, if you take people who are using certain drugs, nobody has ever done the study, but I truly believe that some of the drugs gay men use, like Poppers and other things, cause positive readings on the so-called HIV antibody tests.
I think you might be onto something. I know I've looked into some of the IV drug studies, and there is one famous study from Montreal published around 97 that showed that the risk of seroconverting increased dramatically if you used clean needle exchanges, which is totally counterintuitive with an infectious theory, but it seems that those using clean needle exchanges use more drugs, and so therefore maybe the HIV test is sort of monitoring how many immune stimulants you've had in the past, and maybe that's the same with poppers.
Well, the whole idea that you can pinpoint the HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, via a set of proteins is given lie to by the fact that we know that there are about more than 70 different conditions that can produce these proteins in the blood. And these tests have never been claimed, even by their manufacturers, as saying they're tests for infectious virus present in the blood. They're just simply tests for proteins that cross-react with other kinds of body processes.
And of course, the sheer beauty of what you mentioned about the ones using clean needles more likely to be positive, the simplest question imaginable, and I posed this decades ago, would be to ask intravenous drug users who had an AIDS diagnosis, did you ever share needles? Yes or no? And it never occurred to them to ask the question, but someone like William Burroughs, who's certainly knowledgeable about drug use, said that intravenous drug users virtually never share needles. They're not stupid, and they very well know about the dangers of things like serum hepatitis from that. Very likely, a lot of these people, intravenous drug users, never shared needles at all.
And another problem with drugs is that people think about people injecting heroin, but in actual fact, people don't inject heroin. They inject a mixture that contains heroin and a number of other substances, toxic solvents, byproducts of an illegal production of a drug. At the RA 2009 conference, some Italian researchers showed body parts of insects in the drugs and chunks of metal. And so who knows what you're injecting into your arm every day if you're doing heroin or injecting cocaine or whatever.
As far as immune deficiency is concerned, you can go back to that old 1992 Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid. Well, in this case, it's the drugs, stupid. It's not some mysterious retrovirus that's attacking your immune system. It's the heroin or the amphetamines that you're shooting into your veins, or the heavy metals, that the impurities that are the bathtub gin of the America's war on drugs that you're shooting into your veins. But, we decided to use 19th century single pathogen theory here and decide that, well, this must have been a retrovirus, and we've got that blood-borne retrovirus, and we've got to get rid of this retrovirus if we want to get rid of AIDS.
I think the intravenous drug users are the very simplest case. I mean, my take on what I call the risk, and Duesberg did the risk-AIDS hypothesis, is that different people with AIDS diagnoses are getting sick in different ways and for different reasons. But the intravenous drug users, the heroin users, are getting sick in exactly the same ways they were sick 100 years ago. Right. They're emaciated, and they get lung disease of one sort or another. They waste away. That was true 100 years ago. It's true now.
Yeah, or they get infections that get out of control because they're sticking needles in their arms all the time, and their immune system is impacted by what they're injecting, and so they get a small sore and it doesn't heal.
Yeah.
I just went on to the CDC website for National HIV Testing Day, which I'm sure everybody knows is June 27th. And I think what the CDC says supports your viewpoint about the bias, John. It says that CDC recommends that everyone between the ages of 13 and 64 be tested for HIV at least once in their lifetime. Testing once a year or more frequently is recommended for people at high risk, such as gay and bisexual men, injection drug users, or people with multiple sexual partners. The only other group they mention is that the CDC also recommends that pregnant women get tested early in their pregnancy. So that definitely supports the viewpoint that they're targeting gay men, drug users, etc.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you were to look back in the 70s, the heyday of poppers, if you were to look at sex magazines for heterosexuals, you would never find poppers at all. And yet, if you looked at gay publications, they would be ubiquitous. Well, this is strange. I mean, in marketing, you want the biggest market you can possibly have. And Why not in things like Playboy or Penthouse or things like that, or Screw? But they were not there. The same thing with the get tested thing. I mean, if AIDS were a venereal disease, you would expect to find it in sex publications for heterosexuals. But as far as I know, you do not find it.
Well, and besides, what's this business about testing once in your lifetime? If you test at the age of 13, you've satisfied the CDC's recommendation that a heterosexual be tested once in their lifetime. But, at 13, you're probably not even sexually active.
Well,
So
yes.
that just makes no sense if it was a venereal disease.
Yes, indeed. What can I say?
It's just another insanity of the whole thing.
Tell us about your other work, John. What have you done besides exposing AZT and poppers? How have you attempted to try to bring some truth to this whole 25 years now of belief that a single pathogen has caused an amorphous health syndrome?
You're talking about AIDS now. Yeah.
Yes. What other things have you? What other areas have you looked into besides the poisonousness of AZT, the poisonous nature of poppers, that could give us some insight into whether or not there is still something that we can even call acquired immune deficiency syndrome among gay men?
Well, that's both the starting point and the end point. I mean, before the notorious 1984 press conference, it was clear that the definitions of AIDS made absolutely no sense, and that it clearly was a construct rather than a coherent disease. Then they changed the definitions of AIDS several times. The old definition of AIDS really peaked about 1986 and was going down, and then they greatly expanded the definition, and it went up, and also with the administration of drugs like AZT, which can cause any number of the AIDS indicator conditions, it went up. But that's one thing, that AIDS has never been defined rationally, and it's changed drastically over time. Second, whatever so-called AIDS might be, regardless of the definition, it's not infectious. And this can be demonstrated very simply. Any infectious disease will spread out into the general population. You don't have any true infectious disease that remains compartmentalized by cultural groups. But AIDS has. It has remained rigidly compartmentalized, confined in the United States almost entirely to intravenous drug users and gay men.
Aren't there a considerable number of gay men who are sort of living a double life, or where they're sort of, for societal reasons, maybe married and pretending that they're heterosexual, but still innately they're homosexual? And wouldn't those bisexual men be bringing the virus into the general community?
Well, yes, and of course, you mentioned earlier Arthur Ashe being heterosexual, which undoubtedly he was, but I would hesitate to say that he was not gay. He might have been, And since people have to hide such things, it's very well nobody would know about it. But certainly, you would expect the spread, and once it spread beyond bisexual men, you would expect it to spread. You would expect prostitutes, female prostitutes, to have a very high rate of AIDS infection and AIDS. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. See, I got HIV.
We all get confused.
Well, we get sucked into it. That was me, not thinking. And yet, female prostitutes have actually rather low incidence of being HIV positive.
And even when they're HIV positive, they often stay that way for years without any disease.
Unless they take drugs, which a lot of them do, and then they do get sick.
Prostitutes you're referring to in places like North America where drug use is associated with prostitution, but in places like Africa it's not.
Oh, I didn't. Well, okay.
Yeah, because it's an economic. I mean, people are in prostitution in Africa because they're poor. People become poor in North America because they do drugs, and I think that's the only connection. But there's many studies in Africa of prostitutes where the scientists from North America and Europe go over and try to figure out why prostitutes are staying so healthy or staying HIV negative, despite, thousands of episodes of unprotected sex every year.
Well, of course, people always bring up Africa. They say, well, what about Africa? And my thing is very simple, sort of cutting the Gordian knot by just saying whatever is happening in Africa has no relationship whatever to what's happening in the United States that's called AIDS. Different epidemic, different alleged pathogens, different epidemiology.
We even had to give it the pathogen a different name, not HIV-1, but HIV-2. Very convenient. Since we couldn't get HIV-1 to cause sickness among heterosexuals in the white West, we decided there must be an HIV-2 that will make all these black Africans with their weird sexual practices get this disease caused by a single pathogen. And of course, that is exactly where we are right now. We have a disease noticed by the CDC, or the NIH, as a gay disease in the early 1980s, and now we're saying it's the same disease that Africans have, but it's HIV-2, and it's in heterosexuals instead of homosexuals. Talk a little bit about how we made that transition from this being AIDS for gay people versus AIDS for Africans.
It's utterly absurd because viruses are quite ancient, and to imagine that in the course of a few years, two completely new viruses crossed from animals to humans, or whatever the myth is, causing illnesses the world had never seen before, is ridiculous. But then everything else is ridiculous also.
One thing you've followed since the very beginning is the rethinking or dissident movement. And would you like to comment on how that's changed and where you think it's going today?
Well, I don't know where it's going. Schopenhauer made a comment at one point that all truth goes through three phases. First, it's ridiculed, and then secondly, it's violently attacked, and then third, it's regarded as self-evident. And we certainly have gotten plenty of ridicule. And even before that, there's the silent treatment, which would be reflected in the total media censorship in the mainstream media. But we have been very much under attack in the last few years. We're called AIDS denialists, which is supposed to be an analogy to those who are Holocaust denialists. It's supposed to be something so evil, unthinkable. And yet, we have saved lives, and the bastards on the other side, the one, profiting from it, have been responsible for whatever it is, well over 500,000 deaths in the United States alone. But none of them deal with the arguments we've raised, which are, basically rather straightforward and simple. They all go into ad hominem attacks on us. The latest one is Seth Kalichman.
Oh, yes.
And I have an article on him. I would recommend this to people. If you do a Google search and simply Google on AIDS critics, you will get this among the first few things. It was published in the Gay and Lesbian Humanist, which is, as far as I know, the only gay publication now that will publish articles by AIDS critics.
We'll add that to the show notes, a link to that article. And what did you basically say about Kalichman and people like him in your article, just as a summary?
Well, he wrote a book. I don't have the title of it right here. It's something like AIDS Denialism. And it's a shoddy thing. It never comes to grips with any of our arguments at all. It's just ad hominem attacks on the brave men and women who've stood up to the AIDS establishment. It's an ad hominem thing in the sense that he's a clinical psychologist, the shrink, in other words, as opposed to experimental psychologists who are the good guys who do something useful. And it's trying to make it look as though we were sort of conspiracy nuts, for failing to believe the authorities, the prevailing verities.
Well, there's no doubt that the HIV/AIDS industry is really pretty much a religious cult. The science really has taken we're not really into science when we're talking about the AIDS truthers out there. They're people who have decided that they need to do ad hominem attacks on anybody who questions any aspect of their truth, their belief system. It's really a religion that we're facing right now.
And it's a whole era, I think, in general, of conformism. I mean, I was an adolescent during the McCarthy period, and I was horrified by his purges of, say, homosexuals from the State Department, his allegations of communism and other things for, people who really were not. But it was almost total. Nobody stood up to McCarthy for a long time, and the Christian Science Monitor was virtually the only newspaper in the United States that stood up to McCarthy. The New York Times, all the others, more or less went along with him. And then it turned out because McCarthy started attacking members of the ruling class, and that, was not to be tolerated, and so they quickly put an end to him.
Well, we're coming near the end of our hour, David. I think you had a last question that you wanted to ask John?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, John, if you could recommend one or two future guests for the show and briefly describe why you think we should interview them.
Oh, I don't know who you've had already. And I don't know if they... there's my friend Ian Young in Canada.
In Toronto.
Right, and Ian co-edited with me the book called The AIDS Cult, which is a collection of essays on the psychosocial issues involved in AIDS. Ian would be very articulate. Of course, there's Joan Shenton in England. I greatly admire the work that was done, the Meditel documentaries that were shown over Channel 4 television and seen by tens of millions of people. But they never were allowed to air in the United States. So I think as a hypothesis, it's very likely that there's an enormous difference between the death rates from AIDS in the United States and in England.
Well, even between the United States and Canada, most statistics are 5 to 10 times higher per capita in the United States than in Canada.
Yeah, well, the documentaries, one was called The AIDS Catch, one was called AZT Cause for Concern, were aired in Canada as well. And so the day after the documentary AZT Cause for Concern, thousands of patients flushed their AZT capsules down the toilet. And doctors were hysterical because they could not get their patients to take their medicine. But in the United States, the expose of AZT, nobody knew about it.
Right, and people can still get Joan's videos on the Immunity Resource Foundation, immunity.org.uk, and I'll add that to the list too. But those are great suggestions. Both Ian Young and Joan Shenton are definitely people we should have on the show in the future, and we haven't interviewed either of them, so I greatly thank you for that. And I'd just like to thank you so very much for being on the show. I'm grateful particularly to have you on the show because you're such a veteran of the Rethinking AIDS movement, and I think your work on AZT and paupers in particular has saved many, many lives.